Hello. So in this video we're going to discuss Iyorwuese Hagher's play Mulkin Mata, which is a very loose adaptation of Aristophanes Lysistrata. So it's set in Africa in the mid-1980s. The play was developed by Hagher and a group of grad students at the University of Jos in 1985 through workshops, and then it was presented in 1986. And one of the things that inspired this, as he says in the introduction, is that in 1985, at a meeting in Nairobi, the women of the world met and planned a world strike demanding, among other things, wages for domestic work and greater liberties. So this was inspired by the sort of developing spirit, especially in the global south in the mid-1980s, pushing for women's liberation in African countries, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and places like this. And so what happens in the play, in Mulkin Mata, is that a women's revolutionary government takes over Africa. So in the first scene, we get a newscaster. We start with this sort of meta-theatrical gesture of a newscaster who says, "The women of Africa have taken over the command and government of the nation Africa, in a prolonged and bloody revolution which has claimed the lives of thousands of men and women all over the country of Africa. The All-African Women's Revolutionary Government has named a 45-year-old woman, Iyorwuese Hagher, from the state of Nigeria as the new head of state. At the State House, Addis Ababa, this evening, the head of state and commander of the revolutionary forces of Africa, Iyorwuese Hagher, addressed to the world press." And so then we get Usumana's speech. And it's a very sort of typical revolutionary speech, talking about liberation and the ideals of the revolution, the idea of rebuilding the economy, establishing a better quality of life, things like this. But she gives us two things that I think are really interesting here. So one is that she says, "The Revolutionary Women's Government of Africa comprises of the All-African Women's Revolutionary Council, which is the highest ruling body, the Council of State, headed by a female governor in each of the African states, and the Council of the Grassroots, headed by a grassroots chairwoman in each grassroots government, are to be set up soon." So what this Revolutionary Council sets up is a series of interconnected governments. So you've got a continent-wide government, but then you've also got state governments for each of the African nations, and you've also got more localized government, all of which is interconnected. So they've developed a sophisticated approach to multi-layered government, which I think is really an interesting approach. And then the other thing that's crucial in Usumana's first speech is the set of 3 decrees that she issues. So one is that men are going to be banned from holding political office for the next 100 years. Decree 2 is the reversal of roles decree, in which men are going to do traditionally women's work and women are going to do traditionally men's work. And then the third decree, number 3, the sex prohibition decree, this is the one that takes us into the territory really of Lysistrata, in which the sex strike is a central component of the play. Basically, the third decree says, sexual intercourse is hereby banned until the economy improves. Any man caught attempting to break this decree will be castrated. So, unlike in Lysistrata, where the sex strike is about ending a war between two factions, the Athenians and the Spartans, in this case, the sex prohibition is tied to women's liberation, to political equality, and things like this. And we get throughout the play this sort of revolutionary rhetoric, including the scene following that speech. We have a set of women who are oppressed by their husbands, whether that's being forced to do a lot of manual labor to support the household, or whether that's essentially being marital raped. And each of these women are beaten or threatened with being beaten. And the voice of Usumana sort of comes to these women and tells them to rise up against these male oppressors. And at one point, Usumana says, "There is nothing to lose except your shackles," which is, of course, the great line from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, often translated into English as "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." So, I mean, we got that very clearly. There's also an element here, an element in this play where the women confront sort of traditional African monarchs, African traditions, which in some cases, in many cases, are rooted in patriarchal domination. So at one point, the traditional heads of these various African states, Libya, Lesotho, Ghana, Egypt, Nigeria, the traditional heads of these states come and see Usumanu and basically try and bargain with her. Like they demand money, they demand Rolls Royces, they demand public works projects devoted to them. And specifically, they demand to be exempted from the sex prohibition decree in exchange for ensuring that their people pay taxes to the Women's Revolutionary Government and basically spying on their people on behalf of the revolutionary government. So they sort of come and make this offer. And Usumanu responds and says, "I've heard you are great custodians of culture, are pillars of tradition. I've heard you well. Now let me tell you. It seems that you are not aware of the winds of change that have blown over this continent. You also cannot or do not appear to grasp the spirit of this administration, otherwise you wouldn't be here threatening me with your disgusting, selfish requests." And they protest, and she has them arrested, and she says, "I shall ask your wives to take over your palaces and chiefdoms with immediate effect. Africa will march on without your decadent institutions." So this is very much a thoroughgoing revolutionary movement, but it's also, as is so common with revolutionary governments, revolutionary movements, it's subject to counter-revolutionary forces or reactionary forces. At one point in episode 5, we have an All-Africa Men's Conference at which representatives from a bunch of different male representatives from a bunch of different African nations come together and sort of try and plot ways of overthrowing the women's revolution. And I mean, it's very clear from some of the things that they said that they do see this as a sort of existential struggle. So some of the things that they proposed, the the representative from the Cameroon proposes trying to develop a type of poison gas that will only kill women. The representative from Ethiopia wants to restrict women's food intake so that they can only carry out sexual reproductive labor. So we've got this distinctly counter-revolutionary element here. And so that's, again, very typical of the actual experience of revolutionary movements. And, of course, Africa has seen any number of revolutionary governments and then counter-revolutions and things like this. So this is very, very much rooted in the actual experience of many African nations. There's a couple of other things I do want to talk about with this. One is the sort of pre-elements of the play, because at the very beginning of the play we have these stage directions that say the mood of this play must be established from the box office. The usual roles of issuing tickets and ushering people into the theater reserved for pretty young ladies must be taken over by young men who are as pleasant as possible. Posters and slogans about the oppression of the African woman and the need to liberate her should be freely and copiously displayed. The music coming from the theater from the opening of the box office is unmistakably martial music. This music envelops the theater completely. It is both eerie and premonitional. So this is really interesting because what Hagher is proposing here is essentially that the structure of the play, or the mood of the play, should expand beyond the runtime of the play itself. And so this is actually really interesting because there's a theater theorist named Rick Knowles, and in his book Reading the Material Theater, he talks about the importance of things like the box office, things like the community in which a particular performance is produced, and the sort of physical environment of a theater as crucial elements to the theatrical experience. So that's actually a really interesting technique at the very beginning. We've also got some sort of out-and-out racism. There's a character, Alhaji Saleh, who has fled from Africa, from Nigeria specifically, and taken a ton of money. So he is a sort of oligarch type figure who, as a business person in pre-revolutionary Nigeria, was accumulating massive amounts of wealth. And so he's fled to London, and he has this white girlfriend named Sharon Smith, who is a bit like the spoiled rich girl from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the one who just sort of demands that all of her wants be met immediately, and that her in her case father, in Sharon Smith's case in Mulkin Mata, her lover pay for those things, meet those desires. So at one point she says, "Yes, Alhaji, I'd like to go to Africa to see all those tall Iroko trees that your people live on, and all those beaches, coconuts and palms, and the wild animals that your people ride. Alhaji, which reminds me, you must teach me a few words of that monkey language you always speak in your sleep. It might come handy in Africa." So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely this sort of racist element in terms of the way that the British characters respond to African characters. And so that's definitely worth noting. But then the last thing I want to talk about very quickly is the end of the play, because at the end of the play, the men's counter-revolutionary forces surround the capital and engage in a battle with the women's revolutionary forces. And we go back to the newscaster who sort of reports on this battle briefly, and then includes statements from these two political scientists. One is Professor Paul Himna, and the other is Professor Deborah Ogunde. So Professor Himna says, "The present situation has been a lesson to the people of Africa to know that oppression in whatever form is repugnant to human existence. As Africans, we must overcome the temptations of replacing one form of oppression with another. I mean that we must not simply change governments because we have the means to do so. We must ensure the improvement of the quality of life for the subjects." And then Professor Ogunde says, "In whatever way we choose to look at the African problem, we must not close our eyes to the issue of oppression. Until the African woman, the peasant man and woman, and the urban workers unite in control of the helms of state, our present leaders shall continue to divide us on grounds of religion, sex, and geographical origins. After this revolutionary struggle, we shall see the light out of this tunnel." And so that's a crucial end point for this play, for Mulkin Mata, because it's imagining the transcendence not only of the revolution and the counter-revolution, it's imagining transcending the need for the revolution and the counter-revolution, imagining a liberatory politics that embraces rather than divides.